I think we have the unenviable task of keeping you from your afternoon tea while following on from Lacey. So I will try to be as entertaining as that, but I can't promise anything. One of the interesting things about the opportunity that we have today, and I think the focus that you've been hearing a lot about, is the idea of taking something theoretical through to implementation. And we don't often, I guess, revisit, once we've done that, what that theoretical basis was. And that's kind of what Keiren and I are going to be focusing on today, is looking at, well, when we approached re-entry design a number of years ago, what was the theoretical basis for that? And really, what does that look like once you get to implementation within, as Lacey's talked a little bit about, a very constrained environment, a resource-constrained environment, an environment that's changed a lot underneath that design. So how does government do that? How do we do change in a constantly changing environment? So I want to talk a little bit today about the theoretical basis for the design of re-entry that happened a couple of years ago. It really was something new for Queensland Government and for corrective services around co-design. So just to give you a bit of a background, traditional service design is very much an event. It's a once-off. You do it once, you design the service, you implement it. It's usually really highly specified. Co-design is not that. Co-design is a process. You don't specify anything up front, you bring everyone together and you do that work together. It's often iterative, always iterative. It's interactive, it's collaborative. There's lots of names that it's been known as over time. Co-design really originated from product design, like designing cars and things that people use. It's been co-opted into the social services sector and into government through the idea of shared and collaborative outcomes. So we're really looking for something where we go, okay, this is an outcome we can all own because we all had a role in actually designing what we're trying to achieve. It is adapted, particularly in the social services sector and in government, to encompass kind of lived experience. And that's something I think is a really interesting idea in our own environment. We did have, as part of the design for these services, quite a significant amount of input from prisoners and offenders themselves about their lived experiences with reintegration, integration, re-entry, to create the actual product or outcome that we came to. The other interesting part about the theoretical idea behind co-design is that all stakeholders have or are given the kind of same priority, I suppose you'd say. So the same idea that everything that you say is valuable. So what someone who may be experiencing the service coming from prison, someone who's out in the community has been successful, someone who's gone to the community and come back being unsuccessful, all of those lived experiences are as valuable as the other. And they're also seen as valuable as the expertise that people like yourselves and myself bring to the table. So often in government, people will design services who really haven't lived through actually experiencing those services. What co-design was intended to do is bring those lived experiences through into that process. So just a little bit of a background on what a co-design pathway looks like. Obviously, you go through a bit of a problem appreciation stage, and this actually commenced prior to my involvement back in 2014. If you think back to Brenton's presentation, and I'm very, very glad that Brenton and Kate went before us because it gives you a really good idea of the environment in which this was occurring. So in 2014, when this whole thing commenced, it was just on that upward trajectory of growth. We're just starting that, and really a lot of us had lived through a period of incredible stability in our system. So we didn't know what was coming, I suppose is what I'm saying. When we did that problem appreciation, we did a lot of work travelling around the state, talking to different people, talking to offenders who are out in the community, talking to people who are in prison about that lived experience, their experience of the current service system that was in place at that time, and what would they like to see? What were the things they wanted from a new service system? Similarly, we spoke to a lot of staff. So we spoke to people in custodial centres about, well, from your experience, people coming in, coming out, what do they need? What do they want? What does it look like? What works? What doesn't? Similarly for probation and parole, what is it that you need? What do you want? What do you want to see out there if we were to completely start again? So that problem appreciation took some time. There was a few false starts in there, but we finally got there and kind of had a really good idea of what everyone saw as the different parts of that problem. Obviously then the next part of co-design is to sit down with everyone and go, okay, well if this is the problem, what's the opportunity? And that's the part that I really like. It's the part that I think often we will sit with our problems for quite some time and we don't really think about, hey, if this is a problem, there also is an opportunity here to do something about it. The opportunity and needs analysis is a really good time to bring in the evidence base. So you've got all this lived experience, you know what the problem is, you're then able to go, okay, let's put this together with what it actually says out there that we should be doing. And I think the Commissioner talked really eloquently about the idea of integrating that evidence base this morning. The third part of that then is innovation. And as Lacey said, innovation and opportunity kind of go together. We do have that opportunity at the moment. We're in a really incredible space right now to be able to look at generating ideas. Similarly, the time frame when re-entry was being put through its redesign, co-design process, there was again another opportunity to do that and to really look at, we can throw this all up in the air and do it in a completely different way. And that was something that was challenging for some people to come to, and we'll talk a little bit about the experience with those challenges and what that means for implementation. Finally, I guess the focus for today is the last part. A very strong part of a co-design or theoretical model around co-design is the idea that you don't just do it as a once-off. It's not that event, it is a process. You test what you've put in place, you iterate, you change, you prototype something, you change it again. And I guess that comes with its own challenges, which we will again talk to very much today. So just for a very quick background, and quite a lot of you have probably seen this slide before, our previous model came from a very traditional research evidence base of about 20 years worth of reintegration research. It is notable that in the last 5 to 10 years, the term reintegration has very much changed to the idea of re-entry. I always personally had a bit of a problem with the idea of reintegration because I think a lot of the people that we're talking about were never integrated in the first place. And the problem with not being integrated is you don't have that stability, and I think we see that in that kind of stuff that Lacey was just talking about as well, around the underlying issues that exist for these people. So if you're not integrated and you go to prison, you can't be reintegrated. You've just got to start from the beginning. Re-entry is a much more straightforward concept, I suppose, when you're talking about what is it that this particular design was focusing on. And that really then we have to, I guess, focus on the fact that if we're talking about designing a re-entry service, that doesn't necessarily address the fact that these people never had that integration, they never had that stability. You are helping someone to re-enter the community that's probably already coming from something that isn't well stabilised and really haven't got that kind of good basis to go back out to. So what you see here is the 3 services that we ended up with as part of the co-design process. What I want to point out is that the Barallan model and the Mara model, or the SEQ Women's Re-entry Service, both came with new funding. And both of those were true co-design processes. So when we talk today about co-design, both of those were new money, new and co-designed from the ground up. The men's re-entry service was not a co-design process. It had elements of a co-design approach to it, but it wasn't the kind of full co-design process that particularly the South East Queensland Women's and Barallan went through. And the co-design process itself is quite complex. There's quite a few stages to it. There were a few people in this room that were heavily involved, particularly in the women's process, which we also combined with a procurement process. Probably would advise against doing that in hindsight. Combining procurement and co-design is an interesting experience in and of itself. The men's re-entry services, there was no new funding. So this was just a pool of funding that already existed. It hadn't changed since 2008. And as we know, at the time that this was starting to be implemented, if you remember back to Brenton's slide, this was just at the point where that growth was starting to take off. Between the time when these services were implemented, and you'll see they're mostly around 2015, you would have noticed that since then, at the exact time of implementation, we've had a 50% increase in the growth in our system. So what does that mean for implementation? Keiren will talk to that in quite some detail. So finally, for my part of this presentation, I just want to touch on the principles of co-design in particular. So there are some very clear principles around co-design that have been now quite well established in the literature. One of that is around inclusiveness. So obviously it's a much wider number of people designing services than what we would traditionally access. Asking people lots of questions, more ideas, actually means a much more complex process to be able to incorporate all those ideas. So you actually end up with way more information once you start to become more inclusive. It's very respectful. The idea is that all of those participants, as I spoke about before, are experts in their own way and in their own experiences. I think in particular, one of the learnings that we've had is that the expertise of the users in particular is really useful in testing what we, as people who sit in that system, think we know about how these things work and what we think we know about how people actually experience them. That actually may be quite different. And we've had a lot of our own assumptions tested through a co-design process, which I think is really valuable. It's very participative, obviously lots of conversations, lots of activities where you generate that shared meaning. I think what I want to emphasise here is it's a real mindset around partnership. It's really about working together to that collective impact. It's very iterative. As we talk about, they're constantly testing the solutions, constant improvement, and you do have to have the ability for continuous improvement and change management in there. And then you've got your outcome focus. So it is very much about testing those solutions, as I said, but then measuring them and looking at how they're actually working in practice. So I'm going to hand over to Keiren and she's going to talk about how it went in practice.
So just that. Okay. And I think we have 5 minutes left. I'll try to talk very fast. Obviously, I won't be able to take you through in detail in 5 minutes exactly what we found with the implementation, but I can tell you briefly, we're looking at core issues like how are people moving through our systems and what does that mean in terms of their ability to access, how have the service providers gone developing their services, and how have our operational areas experienced the new services. We had we interviewed, we focus grouped, we surveyed, we followed back up with further questions, and we looked at a lot of data. I won't read through all of this. I think you can all see it on the screen. Suffice to say, what we found was that there's a lot of challenges out there. And whereas Lacey, I feel like some of it might be they feel like it's through care and whack-a-mole. Particularly, it's just people are moving so quickly. It's actually been quite brilliant the way the previous presentations have probably emphasised some of the points that we found through the review. The growth is continuing. People are moving too quickly. People remain in prison and are uncertain about their release dates, often until the day they know what that is. The kind of program logic around pre-release preparation for release and assisting people, the providers are severely compromised in their ability to be able to do that. We know that everybody's struggling to keep up with their step in the process, and we know that in the prisons, despite the fact that everybody's working super hard, nobody has that clear coordination role, which means that the first time someone's needs are kind of comprehensively looked at is often the re-entry service, which is clearly too late in the process. We trialled a few things. We had a go at sharing assessments, and that didn't work out very well. And we found that operating around us, one of the biggest issues was assumptions that the service providers could link people to other existing services. And what we found, as probation and parole know very well, there's just not a lot there. And what is there you already know about. We had a vision that the service providers could help us develop that, but in the context of just depleted funding in that sector, which kind of harks back to 2012, particularly around housing. We had to question exactly how realistic were our expectations. What we saw is probation and parole were finding it difficult to see the evidence that some pre-planning had happened. It's because it probably wasn't. We know we didn't have enough funding to really get meaningful growth in our remote areas. We had some design issues where And thinking back to this idea of testing and trialling and changing, the conceptualisation for some of our crisis services, we learnt very quickly it was too late. It needed to happen much more proactively. And that some of our referral processes under the vision that we would have this overwhelming demand, which is what we've been told about during the problem definition phase, didn't actually eventuate. We overdeveloped the referral processes, thinking we would need to have controls, and what we resulted with is a very inefficient process where people felt they could do it more quickly themselves. Okay, what that's meant is continuous cycles: testing, trialling, shifting, testing, trialling, shifting. Underpinning all of this, all of our service providers had staff attrition, significant staff attrition, and that's not just re-entry alone. That's what we can see is a very clear feature of our community service sector. There's not pay parity, they work alongside us, we get jobs, they transition over, or there's funding that goes into something else that's an excellent local program, and people move between funded programs. Amongst all of that though, service providers told us they were feeling like they were getting meaningful services. And we did see examples of really good, if not great, practice once people had found their feet. A summary of our current delivery environment. What we drove ourselves into was the iterative process of co-design started to be directed to problems. It wasn't proactive. It's not been felt as being supportive or that anyone had the time to really resolve the underlying issues. It's also created a lot of confusion, consistent changes. We can see that everybody's under pressure. The system around us, let alone ourselves. The courts are under pressure, the community sector's under pressure. People are clamouring for definitive solutions, but as Anna talked about, that's not really the intention of co-design. It's not something you see that occurring immediately, and people's ability to have the headspace to allow that process to occur has been really difficult when you're in a super busy operational environment. And that's really what we mean by the capacity and space we had to just allow that reform to move through. We certainly we learned a lot about the implementation. QPSR, as Anna alluded to, I think it happened in the second month of this being implemented, and at that stage it hadn't even been implemented across the state. It meant that we had a different lens through which to understand what we were doing to support people as they moved through our system, whether that was from probation and parole to prison or prison to probation and parole. And a very clear picture was created very quickly for us about all of the areas where things may not have been connecting up. We do feel it's created a bit of a weight of expectation on the re-entry service that it cannot solve. It's the bridge, it's not the highway. And I think that we have a range of people feeling disappointed with some of the outcomes in that kind of mismatch of expectation. 1 minute, okay. We certainly, we can see that we put operational areas under a lot of pressure with the iterative process, and we were very clear around how we need to be realistic, but all of that said, we need to continue to focus on continuous improvement to get to our final outcome. So the key question for us was, how do we do that while everybody's very busy doing their business as usual? It left us feeling that we're a little bit like this at the moment. We're so busy with all our work and we have very viable solutions, and we were nodding to each other when Lacey was talking, because this is the key question. How do we create the space to allow us to engage with those solutions without letting our business fall down because of the risk that represents, but at the same time when we just don't have the headspace to engage with it? There are lots of opportunities for us to do that. We need to think very carefully about these pieces of improvement and how we integrate them into our overall offender management process, so people don't walk out the end feeling that their role's been devalued, or that re-entry services, as an example, are duplicating their role and function, particularly when something like this only speaks to that small proportion of people being released from prison, and we could see from Brenton's that a much larger group of people are entering probation and parole directly. So we're asking probation and parole to use a service for one bit, but to do it themselves in another area. It's very tricky. We need to be able to get clear on where are we seeing performance issues, but where are we seeing change management or cultural issues. At the moment, it's very hard to tease those two out. We need to work through when we feel disappointed about outcomes to check that we've been realistic about our expectation in the first place. And just practically, we'd do implementation differently. We would phase in, we wouldn't cut over. Government budget cycles don't always give us the flexibility, and we need to work out ways to do that. We need to get involved more early and try where we can to stop contracting delays, which is one of the things Anna's inferring with the procurement being part of the co-design. It was complex, it took longer than we thought, it ate up our implementation time. We need to look at small-scale pilots and test in a safe environment, and we really saw the value of operational leaders being involved in the process, but we had challenges having that occur with consistent people. It's important, and we need to work out how we can get that. And I don't think any of those implementation issues are new things. We could talk about a whole series of things that have been done in those 5-year periods that Lacey spoke about, where we came out at the end thinking about the same issues. For co-design though, one of the biggest takeaways we hope people absorb here is that it's not a binary measure of success. It's not, did you tick it off and get all your objectives met? It's about, did you make some distance and get some gains? And we definitely have. We do like the squiggly line for the project process there, that's absolutely what it feels like. But we think that with a testing and refining cycle, you need to test and refine, stop, stabilise, and let it happen, come back, retest, re-stabilise. And in conclusion, we're using the picture there of the right way. We may have not had some things work as cleanly as we'd hoped they would, but in the end we still gained some learning about our system through that process. Core takeaways, you can never underestimate how much time or resources are required, and that's both on the operational and the project side, and also things like contract administration. We need to remind ourselves that we made gains and refocus onto the things that we can work on. When we think back to the principles that Anna talked about around co-design, we really need to have a mindset about participating in this that allows us to be tolerant and bring everybody to the table to really build the relationships and make sure that we can both provide and share and receive feedback in a constructive way, because a lot of those principles were very intangibles that are about the spirit of how we work with other people. And I will cut it there. Thank you very much.